Welcome back. This is the second lecture for lecture exam 4, and it's one of my favorite subjects to talk about. We're going to talk about color today and the many different ways that color is used in the animal kingdom. I love to have my students spend time wondering about why things are the way they are, and what's really fun is that this is something that for the rest of your lives, when you go and visit a zoo or see some animals on TV, you might share some of the things that you're going to learn in this whole lecture. It's a whole series of lectures really about different aspects of animals, and today taking a look at color. What we're looking at here is a dart frog. These are little bitty guys that could sit on a nickel, very, very brightly colored. They're poisonous. They've been used to make a dart poison by some cultures of people in the past, maybe still today. And a lot of different zoos are trying to keep collections of these dart frogs because they're so cute and they're so brightly colored. And so maybe you've gotten to see some of them in zoos before. What I'd like to do is think about different aspects of coloration. And so the first thing to really talk about is cryptic coloration. Now, when you think of cryptic coloration, think of camouflage. Think of blending in with your environment. And also, when you consider what we're going to be looking at, don't think about how does this look, how does it blend in when we're really close. Think instead of when another animal is farther back at a distance, perhaps a bird in the sky or another critter walking around at a great distance. Realize that these things tend to blend in at sometimes a greater distance than we're looking at them in these photographs. So here's a polar bear blending in. Well, certainly when you get up really close to this polar bear, you can see the yellowish colors. Also notice that the way the sun is striking the hair creates this white outline of the polar bear that makes it kind of blend in. In the same way, you can see the snow drifts around the polar bear are creating those same kinds of curves. So from a distance, you might only see these kinds of outlines of the polar bear. Here are some salamanders. The whole genus of salamander called Desmognathus is wildly abundant in the Appalachian Mountains. So if you got in your car, you could actually, if you left in the morning, you could drive and see some of these salamanders in the mountain streams of the Appalachians. I've done that a lot, spent some classes going out and finding a lot of them. Well, here's the color patterns that you might see. And what you notice is the color pattern very carefully matches its environment. Now, a couple lessons that we want you to remember that we learned in our discussions about natural selection. These organisms did not choose these. They didn't go to some store and pick out a color pattern to wear. Instead, what we think is there's variation in the color pattern, and those that blend in the best are probably not going to be eaten in the same high numbers as those that stand out. Goodness, how horrible it would be to be one of these salamanders and have on one of those bright orange hunter jackets. That would be a really bad pattern to have. On the other hand, if the environment changes, maybe there's some chemical pollution or something that's wiping out the algae that's coating these rocks, and maybe the whole stream takes on a greenish kind of slick appearance. You can imagine then that those salamanders of this genus that would better match that new environment would be the ones that are more likely to survive and reproduce, and the pattern that we see here on the screen would be then out of favor, and this would be a disadvantage in a different circumstance. And so that's what we were saying about the beans that we were looking at. We said, well, look, there were certain colors, some of the darker ones, I think, that were harder to find. But then we hypothesized that if the beans were actually instead on snow that we had talked about, then that might have been an altogether different outcome. And that's fun and interesting to think about. Here are a couple of different animals. On the left, you can see a bird, and on the right, maybe you recognize this as a lizard. Sometimes they were called horned toads or horned lizards. They're found in desert environments and they eat ants. other small little arthropods. But there are going to be predators, especially a hawk or some other bird of prey that's flying above. And when they look down, you can imagine this would be very difficult to spot. Now we can have some different kinds of photos. Usually in a photograph, people have lined up the subject in the middle of the photo. So that's one of your clues, and you know to look here and see a wolf spider. Wolf spiders are the predators at the small level, eating other spiders and other things that are crawling around on the forest floor. We find them very often if you're turning over logs in a forest around here. You might also find them in your home. Lots of people get freaked out because they can get pretty big. They can be big enough that, once when I was gone away on a trip, my wife called me and she was pretty excited. And I said, what? She said, well, you know, on the bed we've got that nice down comforter. It's really white and even all white. And she was laying in bed trying to go to sleep, and she heard something scampering across the comforter. I said, yeah, what was it? She says, there's a really big wolf spider, and it creeped her out. So in any case, they get to be pretty big, but they really are pretty harmless in our homes, but most of us are creeped out by spiders. Here we can see on a forest floor, they blend in very nicely. So again, what kind of coloration was this? And I hope you guessed cryptic coloration. Now we look at tigers, and we look at unusual patterns. Not everything is easy to explain. And when we look at this, we're going to see coloration can be used for lots of different purposes. Here, someone is, I think, fudged a little bit with this image, but you can see that maybe this was a case to be made that this kind of pattern that we see in tigers might be cryptic coloration, helping them to blend into an environment, especially if there's lots of tall, thin grasses. But there are other reasons why animals have coloration, and we're going to explore some of that. One of them, just to tell you, is that it helps species to identify other members of the same species. Now, my guess is a tiger can use lots of other clues to recognize members of its same species. There would certainly be sounds, and there would be smells, but the sight, and I think the overall size of a tiger would stand out. Here's another example of cryptic coloration. Maybe you can spot the spider that's here on what may be a wheat stem or some other kind of grain. And the spider blends in fairly nicely. My wife and I were out in California a year and a half ago. I don't have the photo, darn it, but we were out looking at different kinds of plants with an instructor. And we stopped by a roadside, and there were some, I don't know, mustard kinds of plants, something with really big yellow flowers. And we stopped to see if we can figure out what kind of plant it was. And as we were looking, about this size was a very bright yellowed spider that even as we're holding the flower, most of us had not noticed the nicely camouflaged spider. Spiders are predators, so it helps for them to blend into their environment. All right, here we go. This may be the highlight of the whole class. At least it's fun for me to talk about. This is something that I took and was involved in. And if we were in class, I would draw this out and make this very painful for you as you try to spot what I'm about to tell you about. So if you know Rocky Mountain National Park, I hope you know what state Rocky Mountain National Park is in. So what state is it? Colorado is the answer. And on the very, very northern edge of Rocky Mountain National Park is a mountain called Mount Lulu. Mount Lulu is about 12,000 feet tall, and my cousin, who's an atmospheric scientist, he came and spoke to the college last year at Blackbird. Anyway, he studies atmospheric science, he looks at global warming and plays a role in studying, understanding how we are changing our climate. In any case, he decided that a few years back, he and I should take a hike, and we should hike all the way to the top of Mount Lulu. And so we did, and it's not really that, I mean, it's a good hike, but the problem is that once you get above 10,000 feet, it's a struggle to catch your breath because the oxygen is so thin. So in any case, it's summer 2010, so this is about 10 years ago. Here's Mount Lulu. I'm an old guy, and I made it to the top, and my cousin decided, it wasn't a very big top, by the way. The whole top of this thing was no bigger than the Zolab. And there's a little pile of rocks that people had brought up and gathered so you could crouch down amongst the rocks and avoid the wind and catch your breath. And so we were each going to take pictures of each other. And as my cousin Ian backs up to take a picture of me, and so here's the picture of me, and there's the pile of rocks, and here we are. So literally, I'm standing on the edge of Rocky Mountain National Park. Everything behind me is Rocky Mountain National Park, but everything right in front of me is actually not in the park. So I'm right on the border. And as he's taking this picture, I noticed something moving, something about the size of some of these bigger rocks, about the size of the hat, about the size of a chicken. And there were two of them. And I saw them rustle and move about. And the reason is, and these birds called ptarmigans, the reason they were moving was because Ian almost stepped on them as he's backing up to take my photo. So I had him stop, and I took some photos of these ptarmigans. I have to tell you about these birds. So as you look right now on this mountaintop, there's not trees here. This is above the tree line. So if there are birds that live up here, they don't really have a place to hide. I mean, there's this pile of rocks right here that would help them out a little bit. But otherwise, they're just hanging out on the surface. And since then, I've gone into other parts of Colorado, and we've seen up to 10 ptarmigan, and they are right out in the open. And so the only thing that's really saving their lives is camouflage, cryptic coloration. So here if you can study this right away and pick out the two great big birds. So they're going to kind of look like, maybe doves, but they're about the size of chickens. So these are the pictures I took. Notice, by the way, not really a place to hide. And these aren't little bitty birds where they're hiding in the shadows here. They're really pretty big, and they're about the size of the biggest rocks in this picture. So can you see the two birds? Well, I'm not going to drag this out like as much as I do in my usual Olin lectures. I like to go in the back of the class and look at this and have some of you speculate where the birds are. So here's what they look like. This is an idea actually in animal behavior called a search image. And a search image is a mental idea of what you're looking for. So this is the search image. But just to help you out, some of you have come back after class, you've lost your keys, you've lost something. And usually when it's a set of keys, first thing I say is, well, what did they look like? They look like keys, but did you have them on a great big red thing, or a great big orange thing, or a great big white thing? Was there a disc? Was there a ball attached to them? What was it? And so then we start looking for that kind of color and that kind of size and shape. That becomes our search image. So this is your search image for what ptarmigan look like. And that was Lucy banging her ears. Okay, the next is a close-up. I'm sure you'll be able to see the ptarmigan right away when I show you this photo. So there they are. And this is really a close-up. So I hope you can see them. They're right there, right in front of you. It's hard, isn't it? It's really hard. Remember that them blending in, and this is not even as far away as a hawk would be, them blending in is their sole way of surviving and avoiding predators. I'm going to zoom in even more. So now this is the second zoom in, and here they are, right there in front of you. Be kind of neat if some of you spotted them. They're really big in this photo. Once you realize where they are, you kind of realize, gosh, they were right there in front of me. How about this for a zoom in? Now these birds are about 1/6 of the entire picture. And when I do this in the lecture hall, more than half the class still has not seen these birds in these photos. So I'll point out the eyes, and we'll talk more about eyes, but eyes are a real important way to identify an animal because they tell you where the head is. So there's the eyes on the one on the left, and there's the eye on the one on the right. And so I'm going to use the cursor here on the left side, and I'm outlining the ptarmigan right here in the grass. So it's facing a little bit away from us. It's a side view, but directed away from us. That's that one. And then on the right side, here's the head, and there's the body nestled down there in amongst the grass and the rocks. So that, for me, I've not seen anything better that shows cryptic coloration, and this is really one of the best examples. Here's some other examples of things we see. Animals that often change their shape, their outline, so that they can look here a little bit like, sorry, this is going to be Alexa reminding us to do yoga. That's going to be off in the background. She's going to remind us one more time. Here we go.
This is a reminder. Yoga.
Which is a good reminder for all of us to do a little yoga and do a little meditation in this time of stress. All right, walking sticks. I hope you've had a chance to see walking sticks in your life. Lizards that are on the side of a tree, blending in very nicely. Here's a moth. This is one that's more difficult, usually for students. Again, one of the little tricks is when you look at photographs like this, the critter is almost always in the middle of the photo. So I won't make this too long for you. This is a grasshopper. And there it is. There's his head right here. That little black line is what makes some of this difficult because that black line is lining up with part of a crack in these rocks or a gap between these rocks. That's probably one of his legs. And then the shape of the body going back like that. So I think it's a cricket or a katydid or a grasshopper or something of that sort. Here, caterpillars hanging out, other grasshoppers blending in very, very nicely with their environment. Here's a praying mantis that looks like a leaf. Again, realize that there's nothing clever. This is, I regularly hear people make comments about, oh, look how bright and clever they are, that they figured this out, they're looking like a leaf. No, there was variation in the body shape, and those that happen to be more leaf-like were more likely to survive and reproduce. Okay? And so these guys hang out on plants that have leaves of this shape, and so they can blend in. Now, a different kind of coloration is one that makes it tough to see the outline of the critter. Disruptive coloration is where here in a couple animals together, the patterns kind of make our eyes go crazy, and we have trouble initially seeing the critters and recognizing individuals. Now, it helps to count heads, but if you just looked at the body shape. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dash through some of these photographs just like I would normally do in class, and we'll see how you do. So, how many zebras were there above and to the right? I'll do it kind of quickly again. Well, above, I'm sorry, I'll go back. Above, if we're counting heads, I count 6. But you can see that the stripes make it difficult to see the outline of the body. But it's not stripes that are on the very edge, but in fact another kind of a pattern that makes it difficult to see. Over here on the bottom right, oh my goodness, all of these guys. So counting heads, and you start looking and realize there's a head, there's a head. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's probably an 8th here, a 9th here. There's a butt, 10th. I think that's his. least an 11th animal right there. So when you look at that, it's difficult to pick out any one individual. And what we see when we look at large predators feeding on animals like zebras is that they tend to single out one individual that they're going to chase. And so if the group stays together and no one is singled out, they're more likely to survive. And just a little fun note, in England they call these zebras, not zebras, but zebras. And when I take students to scientific meetings, one of my favorite times is when we wind up at some paper that's talking about zebras, and somebody British will go zebra, and then my students will look over at me, give me a look like, I thought you were kidding. No, they really do say zebra. Okay. So that was that. Here's a really big, very classic example. You'll see this in an awful lot of birds, in which this is disruptive coloration. So we've got some lines here that help to break up the body and might make it a little more difficult to see the head. But then look for this. So when you go to zoos and other kinds of places where you see wildlife, it's on TV or YouTube or wherever, you'll see a line going through the eye. And if you got farther back, you'd realize that now instead of a dot for an eye, it's a stripe. And I told you that spotting an eye is really important for predators because it tells you where the organism is. And the second thing is it tells you where the head is. And the head's, of course, a pretty important part of an animal. And if you want to kill an animal quickly, then you're going to do something about hurting the head or disabling the head, stopping the animal from making good decisions and fighting back. Here's another example of disruptive coloration, And when you think of killer whales, they have these kinds of patches of black and white, and they're all different. And right away, it may not be clear to you what's going on until you see pictures like this. So thank you, Jenny Pickles, whoever you are, in which we have some long shots of killer whales from a distance. And you can see that the black seems to kind of match the environment. So when you look at this, you mostly see white patches, irregularly shaped white patches. And it's not immediately clear, what is that? Well, if you're something that fears these critters, could be a seal, could be fish, then you, at a distance, wouldn't quickly recognize that this is a predator. A few more disruptive coloration, some pretty dramatic. How about that? Notice the line through the eye. And a fish like this, sometimes we'll see an eye spot back here on the tail, so that we camouflage the eye here, and then we have a spot over here in the tail, and the predator might be attacking the wrong end. And so here we see some of those eye spots either on the tail or on the top back fin, and of course, again, a stripe going right through the eye. All right, now to something much more dangerous, and that is aposematic coloration. Aposematic coloration is very obvious. It's not camouflage at all. Aposematic coloration is sending a signal. The signal is, I'm a mean dude, and you don't want to mess with me. I'm poisonous, or somehow, otherwise I'm going to hurt you. So as I said here, how nature says no. So here's a caterpillar, leafy spurge hawk moth, it says. And what this moth, this caterpillar, is doing is advertising with orange that it's pretty toxic. And we think orange and red are colors that predators tend to remember. So they're very frequently used to warn that they're a bad dude. And if you see some kind of creepy crawler thing, you turn over a log and you see a brightly colored something, centipede or millipede, remember that we said centipedes are often poisonous and they're often very brightly colored. Leave them alone. I don't pick them up. So we'll talk more about monarch butterflies and their toxicity and maybe their relationship to viceroy butterflies and what's going on there. But what we do know is that monarch butterflies like to feed on milkweed. And there are many different species of milkweed in the state of Illinois. And perhaps some of you have tried to raise milkweed around your house or somewhere that you're trying to encourage the monarch butterflies. We're doing that at our home. And we actually go out on walks, and when we see milkweed, we bring back the seeds, and then we scatter them around our property and our flower beds, really, and we try to encourage the monarch butterflies to come and reproduce. Well, the female will be laying her eggs on a milkweed plant of some sort, and then when the eggs hatch, the little caterpillars are going to feed. When they do, we think that the caterpillars accumulate, well, actually, no, we have good evidence of this, that the caterpillars are accumulating a toxin. And so monarch butterfly caterpillars are not a good thing to eat. So that's what, of course, a regular monarch looks like. And here was an experiment in which they gave a blue jay a monarch butterfly. And that blue jay had never seen monarch butterflies before. And here's what the blue jay did. And just to be clear, you're getting to see a photo. Lucy, you're getting to see a photo of blue jay vomit. So normally we charge you more in the zoology class if we throw in wonderful things like this, but I'm just going to include it right there in your tuition dollar. So it'll just be a thing I just included, a nice photo of blue jay vomit. And what we predict is this blue jay will be much less likely to want to eat monarchs in the future. So at this point, I like to mention that if I was in the class, I would ask if any of you have a fast food restaurant where when you ate there one time, it didn't go down well for whatever reason. Maybe you were nauseated, maybe you thought you got food poisoning, maybe it made you sit on the toilet and you had diarrhea. And then what's fun in the class, and I'm sorry I don't get to do these things, but I'll tell you about it, is that I have you all raise your hand who has at least one fast food place. And then I have you keep your hands in the air and I call on you. And what we find is that when we go around the class, everybody mentions a different place. And that whether it's McDonald's or Hardee's or Burger King or Subway or Taco Bell or wherever, some of you have had bad experiences. The truth is that you might have been sick from something else altogether. But you had a bad experience and you're less likely to want to go back. And that's the thing. So if you had a bad experience, let's say it's Taco Bell, and whatever it is, and I usually have a few people that would tell me it's Taco Bell, they don't want to go back there and eat again. Well, same thing with a blue jay eating a monarch butterfly. So then this raises a great big question. If this monarch butterfly was toxic because the caterpillar was feeding on the milkweed, but the monarch butterfly gets eaten by the blue jay so that the blue jay learns to avoid other monarch butterflies, well, how did it help the one that got killed? And it turns out there's kind of a couple answers here. So how about this question in yellow? Can you pass along your genetics if you don't reproduce? Can you pass along your own genetics, your genes, if you don't reproduce? So I have to tell you another story, and some students have already given me some feedback, and they hope that I do add at least some of my stories to this. And it's a fun story. I was teaching zoology one year, and the next class that came in was the evolution class. And it was an Olin lecture. And as the evolution class came in, a few of the students came in and said, "What the heck did you just do to the zoology class?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" They said, "Oh my gosh, everybody looked really serious and they were looking down and just, you know, nobody was engaging." And I laughed and I said, "Oh, I left them with a cliffhanger question. And it was one that was really thoughtful, which is how can you pass along your traits if you don't reproduce? And we all had a good laugh because the students were doing exactly what I wanted. I wanted them to think. Well, this question, which has to do with here, aposematic coloration and the evolution of these systems, has to do then, of course, with if you have to sacrifice your life to teach a predator to avoid others, how does that help you? How does natural selection favor that? Well, it turns out that the answer that I'm about to go through with you has to do as well with people who don't reproduce. It could be because they're gay. It could be because they're, well, whatever's going on in their life, they're not reproducing. And what we're going to see is if you don't reproduce, but if you help very, very close relatives to reproduce, those close relatives share a lot of your genetics. And so if you don't reproduce, but you help perhaps your brother or sister, or you help your mom and dad to reproduce, you're still passing along a lot of your own genetics. That's the answer. So let's go through this. This is the question that I was raising. If the monarch died in the process before it reproduced, how did that help it? Okay. So we got to do a little bit of math. I don't know if you've looked at this, but in general, when we reproduce, each parent passes along about 50% of their genetics. So what is the relationship between the parent's genetic material and the child? And the answer is 50%, what we just said. And so each parent passes along half of their genetics, and together, after fertilization, then we have 100% genetics. We have a new person who has half their genetics from mom and half from dad. Okay. So now here's something to think about. What's the genetic relationship between your brothers and sisters? Families are very, very different in the United States and all across the world, and not everybody's brother and sister is a full genetic brother and sister with the same parents. But that is what we're considering right now. So if we have a mother dog that has a litter of 5 pups, or if you have brothers and sisters, what is the genetic relationship if you shared the same parents? And the answer is on average 50%. Yeah. So here's how that comes about. Each parent has 2 of most every kind of trait, and they're going to pass along half of that. But which half they pass along? Gosh, it could be that from your mom, it's very unlikely, that your mom, the half of her genetics that she passed along to you, is not at all the half that she passed along, let's say, to your brother. So that would be, you didn't get anything in common. At the other extreme, mom could pass along to you and pass along to your brother exactly the same things. And in that case, that'd be 100%. Well, the same thing for your dad. Your dad could have passed along the exact same things to you as your brother, or nothing in common with your brother. And so in both cases, the range is 0 to 100%, and the average of that is 50%. So that's how we come up with 50%. So now recognizing this and realizing that your aunts and uncles, how much genetics do they share with your parents? And the answer is 50%. So, because they're brothers and sisters, right? Aunts and uncles are brothers and sisters. So your aunts and uncles share 50% of their genetics with your parents, and then 50% of that gets shared with you. So 50% of 50%, or half of a half, is a quarter. And so your aunts and uncles are sharing about a quarter of your genetics. And so you can start doing some math. And this is, by the way, the long human tradition. So if a mother dies in childbirth and she has a child and it gets raised by her sister is raising a child that shares some of her genetics. And if it's just a single child, then the sister would be raising the equivalent of half of a child of her own. If instead, when the woman died in childbirth because she had twins, and the twins survive, and that happens, in fact, twins is a complicated thing, and in modern medicine, thank goodness, we're able to have a very good outcome in most of the cases. Everybody survives. But 200 years ago, back to, however, 20,000 years ago of humanity, if a woman gave birth to twins, she might die. And the twins could die too, but it's possible that the twins would survive. So let's think of that situation. So if your sister dies in childbirth, giving rise to twins, and then you raise both of the twins, they collectively would be the equivalent of one child. So if someone raises two nieces, it's the same amount of genetics. This is what it says right there. It's producing one child. So if the monarch butterfly dies teaching the blue jay to stay away from monarch butterflies, that blue jay will then avoid the brothers and sisters of that monarch. And they will be more likely to survive and reproduce and pass along those genes. So if all these different monarchs all have this warning coloration that they share, and they're all poisonous, they're going to help each other to survive. And that's the bigger, broader thing. It might not even be that they're all genetically related. It might be that simply when all of them do this and all benefit, even those that aren't closely related benefit. And so that's been favored. So here's some of that bright coloration. Those of you that live in southern Illinois or southern parts of Missouri or other places in the United States a little farther south, not much, by the way, only down at about the level of St. Louis is how far you have to go. This is a newt, and this is an eft stage, E-F-T. And in newts, the adults live in the pond, and they reproduce in the pond. And so the little larval newts grow up in the pond, and then they leave the pond, and they go in this stage. And it's for maybe a couple years, they run around, and then they return to the pond, and they change again into a pond-adapted form. During this eft stage, E-F-T, during this F stage in Illinois, these Fs of this central newt, it's a little guy, it might be about 3 inches long, about as long as a cigarette, one of the few good things cigarettes are for, sort of a standard measurement. These little guys are highly toxic. Oh my gosh, a very strong neurotoxin, which will kill you. But the good news is the other toxin is something that makes you vomit, and vomit really fast. So the good news is you might vomit it up before you get poisoned by the neurotoxin. Dogs, by the way, not just these newts, but also toads have the same kind of toxins. So if you see a dog come over and sniff and kind of bother a toad, you might notice that the dog backs away because it's starting to get nauseated. You might notice the dog isn't doing very well if he's tried to eat the toad or otherwise mouth it a little bit, because a lot of those toxins get in the dog's system. So these are the F stages that you might find. And this is where we generally find them. So also farther north. It's just interesting. Macoupin County. So here we are in Macoupin County for Carlinville, for Blackburn College. We don't have them living here, but you don't have to go very far south. We could predict that with the warming climate, we might see a change. It's always interesting to look at what are called range maps, where we find species, and ask the question, what's going on right here at this boundary? And it may not just be temperature, it may also be soil types, it may have to do with standing water, who knows what. Here's more of the warning colorations. This is a great big centipede. I told you to steer clear of these guys because they do have a poisonous sting. More aposematic colorations. So maybe you've learned a saying, red touches black, you're okay, Jack. Red touches yellow, you're a dead fellow. So if you use that, red touches black, you're okay. Red touches yellow, you're dead. So this is a coral snake. The good news about coral snakes is that they have really small mouths. I was going to a nature preserve on at Texas, one of the southernmost parts of Texas, right on the border with Mexico. And I was going out into the park, and I always stop and talk to the rangers. And I said, do you see coral snakes down here? He said, oh, yeah. He says, in fact, there's a coral snake that's right out by the trail. I said, oh, my goodness. I said, you going to do anything about it with the people out there walking? And he said, nah. He said, because, when they bite you, so just look at your hands. Where could a little bitty snake bite you that they could get venom? And the answer is in between your fingers. You've got that little, it's like a webbing of skin there. That's a place. So if you keep your hands as fists and you're around these guys, you'll probably be okay. If you choose to try to pick them up, well, then you're risking your life. So color patterns, not just colors, but color patterns can also be part of aposematic coloration. Here's kind of color patterns that you know to avoid. So when we think of skunks, we know to avoid these kinds of stripes. In fact, skunks, being that they spray this really bad, nasty spray, be interested in if any of you had ever been sprayed by a skunk. Maybe your dog had, and it would stink for quite a while. In any case, skunks can get kind of bold, and I've seen skunks in state parks just walking around in the daytime because they pretty much have a good defense. Well, now when we think of colors and color patterns that are warning signs, we find that sometimes organisms that are not toxic will look like bad dudes and gain some of the advantage of looking like a bad dude, even though they aren't bad dudes. Okay? And that kind of mimicry, so one species looking like another, comes in many forms. Batesian mimicry is where there's one toxic species and then one mimic that's not toxic. And we call the one that is toxic the model. So over here, I think on the left is the model, and on the right is the mimic. So Batesian mimicry is one toxic model and one non-toxic mimic. Oh, I got it backwards. On the left is the non-toxic, and on the right is the toxic. By the way, notice that it's not that these are closely related species. This is a member of Platyhelminthes. This is a member of Mollusca. These are two completely different phyla. This is a flatworm. This is a sea slug, for goodness sakes. But they're both using a similar kind of coloration that we think means that this is the sea slug that's saying, oh my goodness, watch out, I'm toxic. And this is another brightly colored worm that's trying to pick up on that defense. Here's another example of Batesian mimicry. It is very common where we live here in Illinois. All these things just landed on you. The question is, which one of these was something to worry about? So let's go back through them. Which ones do you think you should worry about if they land on you? Well, there's only one here that stings, and that's this one down here. Count the wings. 1, 2, 3, 4. Smaller eyes, pointed abdomen. Big eyes, 2 wings. Big eyes, 2 wings. Really big eyes, 2 wings. These are flies. These 3 are flies. And they have the yellow and black pattern that is characteristic of stinging insects. And yet they're not stinging. So these are all mimics. Happens all the time. When I'm, we're getting really close to the weather, I go out on my deck and I just sit there and I read and do other kinds of things. Watch nature. And pretty regularly, things will land on your arm or, on your leg or something. And boy, I do not swat or scoot something away from me without first seeing what it is. because almost always these critters will fly away on their own and there's nothing you need to do. I have had them fly in between my eyeball and my glasses and sting me on the eye because they get kind of trapped there and get really angry. And so then they stung me there. That was a bad day. But generally, you can look down. And when you look down, when I'm on my deck here in Carlinville, most of the time, what lands on me that's black and yellow is one of these guys. It's a bee mimic that's actually a fly. We talked about eye spots before. More aposematic coloration. A lot of caterpillars, the butt end of theirs looks like a head. We think that maybe this looks like a snake. And so that might be part of what a bird's going to come in, try to eat the caterpillar, and the bird's going to be frightened because now that looks like a predator of a bird. I like this one. I just think it's kind of fun. Here in a case of a moth, the outer wings normally cover the eye spots, and when the moth feels threatened, it'll pull these top wings back and reveal the eye spots, and that may be scaring away predators too. Here, trying to show you again, this is Batesian mimicry, in which we have a non-toxic caterpillar that we think has been favored by natural selection because it looks like the head of a snake. So the whole question, how does Batesian mimicry evolve? And then here's the fun thing to think about. How could it fail? Okay. So let's consider a real popular example. And that is monarchs and viceroys. So viceroy butterflies look a lot like monarchs, and you'll have to go online and learn some of the key differences so that you know what you've got. It used to be thought that this was Batesian mimicry, that we already talked about, monarch butterflies being toxic. Here it's on a milkweed plant. And that viceroys we thought were mimics. We've since learned, by the way, that viceroys are also often toxic. And that actually forms a different kind of a mimicry. This goes back all the way to 1991, and yet some people still don't know the lesson. So we're coming up on 30 years of knowing this. Here's a paper from 1991 in one of the world's most prestigious journals, Nature, in which it says the viceroy butterfly is not a Batesian mimic, that in fact both of them are possibly unpalatable, and that in fact, it says, by revealing that viceroys are as unpalatable as monarchs. And so the kind of mimicry where two species are using a common warning pattern and both are bad dudes, that's called Mullerian mimics. So Mullerian mimics are a bit of what we see going on with wasps and yellow jackets and bees, in which we have the frequent use of the black and the yellow. So how does Mullerian mimicry evolve? How does Batesian mimicry evolve? So I want to talk about that right now, and I wish we had a lot of class time to work in small groups. In Batesian mimicry, clearly an organism, like we were looking at with the monarch, has got some very noticeable pattern, and they're toxic. And when predators eat them, predators quickly learn the lesson. So in natural selection, if there are things that aren't toxic, but they happen to look like the model, they happen to look like the toxic model, well, they gain an advantage. And so how does it evolve? Well, there's one kind of aposematic coloration that's out there, and then other critters that happen to look like that have an advantage. So it's again, nothing that's involving planning. It's just that if there are other species that look like that, they'd have an advantage. Now, I mentioned before, how does it fail? So I wished that we had, again, lots of time for you to think about this, because me just telling you is not the best learning experience compared to you thinking about it. But when you think about how the whole darn system could fail, what if it turns out that 99% of the critters that look like a bad dude aren't a bad dude? Well, then a blue jay could, for example, a new blue jay, a young blue jay, could go out and eat an awful lot of monarch mimics that aren't toxic and not have the learning experience. And so that blue jay, for all it knew, was things that looked like monarchs are pretty good eating. And it was eating a lot of them because they're mimics, they're not toxic. And so you could dilute, is the way to think about this. You could dilute the effect of being a toxic organism with aposematic coloration. If there's enough mimics that aren't toxic, well, it could make it so that predators don't really learn to avoid the toxic or rarely learn to avoid the toxic. And so we say that breaks down. How does Mullerian mimicry evolve? Well, in this case, it's very reinforcing. So it's likely to evolve in which some pattern has emerged as the aposematic pattern, the warning pattern. Here we were saying yellow and black banding, and that common pattern is favored. And because they're both bad dudes, oh my gosh, then there's tremendous protection. Now, members of another species could lose their lives teaching a predator to avoid that pattern. And here in another species, nobody has to die and they still benefit. So Mullerian mimicry, and certainly when it comes to wasps and bees and other things that are the black and yellow, well, we really learn to avoid that. So that's why Mullerian mimicry is less likely to fail. Now just a little bit of fun. There's a singer, more of my generation. In fact, if I went to one of his concerts, and in fact, just about everybody was my age, so I don't know that there's a lot of people of your generation that enjoy him. But his name came from the fact that when he was, as it says, when he was practicing one day, he wore a black and yellow sweater, and so the band members called him this. And maybe you recognize this from quite a few years ago as Sting. So that's the singer Sting. And it came from him wearing the black and the yellow bands. All right, that's the end of aposematic coloration. That's the end of us talking about mimicry. So now maybe you want to take a break, but I'm going to keep plowing ahead here, and we're going to talk about some other really cool, fun things. And I wish that, again, we were together and I would torment you and we would really think this through. But why are the bellies of sharks white? Why are mouse bellies white and bird bellies are white? Kangaroo bellies are white, snake bellies are white. We looked at earthworms, their bellies are lighter in color. Here, I think, in this deer-like critter, might be an impala. Here we even see sort of different shades. So here we've got like a side panel that's an intermediate color between the dark back and the light belly. Yeah, it's an impala. Here we're seeing a shrew of some sort. I guess it's a sugar glider with a light belly. So it turns out that an awful lot of vertebrates have lighter colored bellies. And the answer largely has to do with taking a look at this critter over here. So this is an evenly colored white, I don't know, ostrich. And when the sun comes down on its back, it casts a shadow on this side of the body. And that shadow tells us something about the 3 dimensions of the critter. I don't know if you've ever taken an art class or a photography class in which you learn about the importance of shadows. But shadows reveal the three-dimensional shape of anything. And because the light doesn't hit something evenly, a shadow is cast. And so here in this, if it's an ostrich, looks like it is, we have a shadow created. And so the animal stands out because you have a very light colored top and a dark colored bottom. But if you have a lighter colored belly and the sun hits you and a shadow is cast, well, by having a lighter colored belly and then the shadows there, it tends to make the tone even all the way across. So the difference between the top, the dorsal side, and the ventral side is more even than it is over here. And so what is it that we call this white or lighter colored belly? We call it counter shading. And it is just that. It is countering the shadow, the effect of the shadow. Now, why are shark bellies white? That's maybe a different answer. Seen from the side, this would still have the same effect as the ostrich. But seen from below, this may blend in with the sky. And seen from the top down, this may be a better blending in with the darker bottom. So that may be true. When we think of penguins, we can see a very clear demarcation between the white belly and the dark back. And so for these guys, it may have to do more with, again, when they're at the surface. Here we are looking up at the belly of a penguin, kind of blending in with the sky. And here we are looking down, and clearly that dark back of the penguin is blending in more with the water. Terrestrial, same thing. Lighter colored belly of looks like a cougar and a little cottontail bunny. And here the lighter colored belly, so that when there's bright sunshine on the back, it creates a shadow here and creates an overall even illumination that helps them to blend into their environment. Here, trying to show you the same thing. If we take a cylinder that's evenly colored, that's what A is, then we see right here that a shadow is cast, and you can clearly tell that this is some kind of rounded structure. Now if we take something that has counter shading, so it's not evenly colored, it's darker on the top and then lighter on the belly, then we shine light on it, a shadow is cast, and it is evenly dark. So this is the explanation. You can look up counter shading on the internet and learn a little bit more about this. So this is not an animal that's very well blended into the environment, and my guess is that people bred these animals to favor this kind of color. Now, coming near the end, we're taking a look at some other aspects of color, and this could be a long discussion just as well. If you're lucky enough to see goldfinches, and if you feed thistle or sunflower seeds, as we do at our house, we get, upwards of 30 to 50 goldfinches, and they're starting to gather at the feeder around my house. And at this time of the year, when birds are mating and reproducing, the colors of male birds are often very bright. This is a time when cardinal males are very bright, and in the case of goldfinches that live around here, very, very brightly colored males, and more camouflage, cryptic coloration here. Here's some of the dramatic coloration we see on these birds from the Galapagos. Bright coloration as well in male fish, and of course the grand champion is the peacock. We know that females like to, in these species, females are attracted to males with the brightest colors, these elaborate displays of color. The question is, why do females prefer these brightly colored males? Now, something to bear in mind is that, are there things that feed on male peacocks? Yes. Are there things that feed on brightly colored male fish? Yes. Are there things that feed on brightly colored goldfinches and brightly colored cardinals? Yes. So you got to realize that what females prefer are males who are more likely to be killed. So why? Why are females preferring males who are doing things where they're more likely to be killed? And it's best if you don't immediately start thinking about what humans do, because I think people run really quickly to the human examples. We can think about that at another time. We see in humans that color is also used for attraction. We think that there are two main ideas. By the way, men, brightly colored just as well. Oops, sorry, I'll go back here. So why is it that females are preferring brightly colored males? And I can't hear your ideas. It'd be great if we had a chance to discuss this, but unfortunately, folks, I'm sorry. But that's not where we're at right now with the pandemic. Well, one idea is that males have to compensate. They probably have to be a little more clever not to get caught, and that they have to be strong, they have to be able to fly away, and that it's sort of a handicapped idea. And so it's a handicapped hypothesis that males who are brightly colored are going to be more challenged to survive, and those that do must have a variety of traits that suggest that they're really healthy and really strong. Another example, or another hypothesis of what's going on indicates that color is being used to assess the health of an organism. So think sometimes in your past, people might have said to you that you don't look well. Maybe your color is faded. Maybe your behavior is not so hot. Lucy, hush. And so if you're really, really brightly colored, you're probably very, very healthy. And in the case, Lucy, come here. Lucy really wants to be part of this lecture. Okay, she's going to run out and bark at something later. All right, Lucy. So the idea about being healthy, if you think about what are, in the case of birds, what are one of the major problems for their health, and the answer is parasites. In fact, birds have a lot of parasites, and that can hurt their health. And so we think that brightly colored males are clearly healthy males that are probably really good at resisting parasites. And they must have some kind of trait that helps them to be healthy at this time. So whether it's the handicapped hypothesis or advertising your health hypothesis, being brightly colored, we think, seems to have those advantages, and that's why females prefer to mate with them. More things about color and things that we'll be getting to about size. First, Glosier's rule. So here's an interesting rule. If you live in a dry environment, you're likely to be lighter in color than organisms that live where it's really, really wet. So we're talking about critters that live in a desert versus critters that live in a rainforest. I think that generally makes sense. And the reason why is, well, if there's an awful lot of rainfall, there's an awful lot of plants. And an awful lot of plants are going to mean that it's a darker environment. But if there's not a lot of rainfall, the plants tend to be lighter in color, and the organisms that live there, for camouflage purposes, tend to be lighter in color. And as we come to the end, here's a really, really, I think, fascinating thing to consider. You think when you go to the zoo, the animals that are the most brightly colored tend to come from near the equator. So Central America, or Central Africa, or India, or southern parts of Asia. And why is that? So here are some snakes from those kind of environments. That brings us back to the dart frogs. And it makes us ask the question, what did we just look at in this whole series of lectures about bright coloration? We said bright coloration might be advertising that you're a bad dude. And we think over here in the dart frog, yeah, that's going on over here. We also said that coloration and patterns are used for species recognition. And we also said that where there's a lot of rainfall, which is near the equator, the environments are darker. So it's a many-faceted answer. There's no one clear answer. There may be an awful lot of critters that are aposematic coloration, like the dart frog. There may be birds, there may be butterflies that are trying to gather together. Butterflies do that as well as birds. And when it's a darker environment, they need to spot each other. And so bright coloration makes spotting each other easier. I don't know if you know, but birds like macaws, parrots, a variety of tropical birds, as it starts getting dark, they make an awful lot of noise and they gather together because that's a safer way to spend the night. If there are a whole bunch of you gathered together, then one of you is likely to notice a predator creeping in and can alert everybody else. So you're better in a bunch. Well, as it's getting darker now, towards the end of the day, in an already dark environment, well, it would help to be brightly colored. The last part of this is when we look at reproductive seasons. So what part of the year is used to find a mate and to reproduce? When you're really far north, for example, up near the Arctic, so North America, the northern parts, Canada, Alaska areas, in those parts of the world, the breeding season is limited to maybe a month when there's really good weather there. And so if there's brightly colored males, all right, for about a month or so out of the year, they're going to be brightly colored. But in a tropical environment, many species reproduce throughout the year. They're finding mates, they're having babies, they're having, if it's bird, multiple clutches, multiple nests in a year full of babies. And so if we extend the breeding season as we do in the tropics, then males may be brightly colored for longer periods of time. Okay? So those are three hypotheses. Aposematic coloration, there's an awful lot of species, and the number of species near the equator is highest. The number of species goes down as you move away from the equator. So if you have a lot of species, you might have more aposematic coloration. Species recognition, so gathering together in these darker environments, that's the second hypothesis. And the third is that males have longer breeding seasons and so stay brightly colored for longer periods of time. And these are the ideas right there. All right, so this ends our look at color. We've looked at lots of different aspects of color, and I hope kind of brought it together there as we consider what's going on in tropical environments. What we'll move on to next is really, really an important part of zoology. We're going to address major misunderstandings in the movies. We're going to talk about all sorts of things that people routinely get wrong, even in the nature films that otherwise are pretty wonderful. And so you'll want to stay tuned for that. That coming up will be the third lecture for lecture exam 4.